Welcome to the program. All right, without any further delay, it's that time of the morning. Let's turn our attention to the Health Hub. And of course, for that, we're joined once again in studio by Mia Malan. She's the editor-in-chief at the Bhekisisa Centre for Health Journalism. And Mia, it's always great having you in studio. There's a lot to get through for this segment. Get us a sense of what we're talking about.
So we're going to find out how HIV prevention pills work and injections that you can use to prevent yourself from getting infected. We'll hear where you can find them and exactly how they work. We'll also find out from Doctors Without Borders why they think J&J has been really slow in delivering our COVID vaccines here in South Africa. And we will break down the new COVID variant in a way that you can explain it to your granny here in studio.
Which is incredibly helpful. I hope my granny is watching because this is some pretty important information. But speaking about variants, which of them have we detected in South Africa and what do we know about them?
So there are many, many variants, and many of those we never hear about because viruses change all the time, and the variants we do hear about are the ones that become dominant. So in easy language, they're the ones that are strong enough to survive and to then take over. And if we look at South Africa, each wave has been dominated by a different variant. So in the first wave, you can see here, it was dominated by the Wuhan variant, and Wuhan because that is the Chinese city where the original form of the virus was first detected, and also a variant called C1, which scientists think is the parent of the new variant C12 that we now have in South Africa. And in the second wave, we had the Beta variant that dominated our wave, and that variant took over from the original variant because it spread faster, it was more infectious, and it also was able to escape immunity. So it made some vaccines work a little bit less well. And now we have the Delta variant, which is the most transmissible form of the variant we know of, and which is still currently the dominant variant, not the new variant, but Delta is still most of the cases in South Africa.
Right. You make mention of the C1 variant. In the past couple of days, the C12 variant has been taking over headlines. It's the new mutation, if you like, that we've discovered in South Africa. What do we know about it and its prevalence?
So we know that it's been detected in all provinces in South Africa. It was first detected in May in Gauteng and in Mpumalanga. And we also know that it has since spread to some other countries, for instance, China. And here in Africa, it's also spread to Botswana and to Mauritius and European countries such as Portugal and Switzerland. But important to note that it's more common in South Africa. It's often single or just one or two cases in the other countries. So scientists think that the variant was first, first discovered here, and then it was South African travelers who traveled to other countries and took it there. So if you look at what is dominant, as I mentioned, the Delta variant is still dominant in South Africa. More than 90% of cases are still Delta in South Africa. We've got very little Beta left, only 2%. None of Alpha. Alpha is a variant that was first discovered in the United Kingdom and that we had a little bit of in the second wave of our COVID. And then C12, only 2.5% of cases so far in South Africa. So still in very small proportions, and we don't yet know how fast it will spread.
Fascinating. We started out with the Beta variant essentially being dominant. Things then changed when Delta came onto the playing field, for lack of a better term. What's the likelihood that the C12 variant will effectively take over infections in our country?
So we really just don't know yet.
Yeah.
What will give it the edge is if it becomes more transmissible than the Delta variant, because then it will take over, it will spread faster, and it will infect more people. But we will have to wait and see. We don't have that information yet. What we also don't yet know is what kind of effect it will have on vaccines. So will it make vaccines work a little bit less well? We will know that data soon. South African scientists are busy conducting lab tests. They're taking blood from people who have been vaccinated and also who have had COVID, and they look at the antibodies in that blood and see how well those antibodies perform against the new variant. So if it neutralizes the variant or if it kills it, basically. So we will still have to wait and see for that. But what we do know is that no variant in the past has been able to escape by much, in other words, to produce by much the protection that vaccines provide against serious COVID. So the type of COVID that makes you end up in hospital, in an ICU, or that leads to death. And scientists say they don't think that the new variant will have properties that will be able to escape protection against serious illness. So mostly when vaccines started to work less well because of variants, it's mostly been that protection against milder forms of COVID that has been infected. So when people who have been vaccinated get infected with COVID, they're likely to have a mild form of COVID compared to unvaccinated people that are likely to be more likely to end up in hospital or die of COVID.
Yeah, so in other words, with all the variants we're seeing, luckily we're still in a space where the vaccines at our disposal are still effective enough. That's probably worth considering, especially given the week that we've just had, right? We've seen 8 vaccine trials, for instance, being taking place in 4 African countries. One of those countries is South Africa, and sadly, those trials failed. The jab actually offered no convincing protection against HIV infection. But, you know, in some respects, it almost feels like it's not necessarily all doom and gloom. What makes it difficult with HIV vaccines is that it is hard to mimic the antibodies, essentially, from people who have been infected with HIV. It's also quite difficult to get a sense of how to keep up with HIV itself because it changes so fast. That's kind of, you know, the information I've been able to come across. I know Mia Malan has a whole lot more details around this. And Mia, we speak usually about biomedical alternatives to treat HIV. What are some of those?
So when it comes to HIV prevention, there's a term that scientists use, pre-exposure prophylaxis. And that's just a big word for explaining that you are taking some form of medication before you get exposed to the virus. So prophylaxis means prevention, and pre-exposure is obviously before you're exposed to the virus. And in South Africa, we have one of those methods, an HIV prevention pill, that you usually have to take daily, but in some cases you can also take it before and after sex, and we have it available in both the private and the public sector. And then there is another form of PrEP. PrEP is the short form of pre-exposure prophylaxis. That's an injection that you can take every 2 months to prevent yourself from getting infected with HIV, but that is not yet available in South Africa. Studies show us that that injection actually works better than the pill, and it's mainly because it doesn't depend on adherence. So it doesn't depend on your ability to remember to take that pill every single day. You just have to take the injection every 2 months. But to find out more about exactly how these pills work and how the injections work, we are joined by Professor Linda-Gail Bekker, who is an HIV scientist and director of the Desmond Tutu HIV Centre at the University of Cape Town. And we're also going to hear from Dr. Yogan Pillay, the country director of the Clinton Health Access Initiative, but he's also a former Deputy Director General in the National Health Department. And he spearheaded the implementation of PrEP, or pre-exposure prophylaxis, in the form of the HIV prevention pill. Welcome to you both, Professor Bekker and Dr. Pillay. Let's start off with you, Professor Bekker. How does an HIV prevention pill work and how effective is it?
Hi, Mia. A pleasure to be on. So the pre-exposure pill, as you refer, is actually an antiretroviral agent. So we know that it is able to kill and stop replication of the HIV virus. So the agent that we use for PrEP is actually a combination of 2 well-known antiretrovirals. One is called tenofovir, the other one is known as emtricitabine, and they have been combined into a single pill, and that pill, tenofovir plus emtricitabine, is able to stop the replication of HIV in the tissues. So it does mean, if we're going to use it as prevention, that we have sufficient of that drug in our tissues at the place where HIV might make contact. So that's where, as you allude, we have to take it ahead of time, and we have to take it sufficiently well that we get our tissue level up in terms of having the actual ingredients at the site should we encounter HIV and it comes into our bodies, it will meet that antiretroviral, which will actually stop it and block it and stop the infection taking hold. So we think it works at that point. Probably, if you acquire your HIV sexually, probably at the lymph nodes of the sexual reproductive tract, and stop the HIV replicating. So it's important that we have sufficient of those two antiretrovirals in the tissues, and that means we have to take it regularly, as you were saying.
Dr. Pillay, if I would like to use an HIV prevention pill, where would I find that in South Africa, and how much will it cost me?
Yeah, thanks very much. In the public sector, since 2016, we have expanded access to pre-exposure prophylaxis oral medication to over 1,900, that's 1,900 public clinics and community health centers. So more than half of all public clinics and community health centers in the country currently offer oral PrEP. And, for the public sector, as you know, for primary healthcare, people don't pay a single cent for any treatment, and that includes HIV treatment, and it includes pre-exposure prophylaxis against HIV acquisition. So it doesn't cost people who use the public sector any money at all. It's completely free. And of course, we would therefore like to encourage people to take up this opportunity to use PrEP if they are involved in sexual activity that might be risky. And that is, in fact, not using condoms, either male or female condoms, having multiple partners, and generally not taking good care of their sexual health.
Professor Bekker, does it have any side effects when you use an HIV prevention pill, and how often do you need to use it? Is it every day?
Thanks, Mia. Yeah, so these are well-known antiretrovirals. In fact, they're the cornerstone of our treatment. So many, many millions of people have actually taken or are taking these two antiretroviral agents in combination for their treatment or as pre-exposure prophylaxis. Now, all antiretrovirals do often cause a little bit of what I call ickiness. When you just start, you feel a little bit out of sorts. And that's really the body adjusting to the antiretroviral agents. And so individuals may feel a little bit of fatigue. They might feel a little bit of nausea, a bit of bloating. But in the vast majority of people, those side effects disappear within a few days to weeks, gone in a month. So we estimate sort of 1 in 10 might have those very early nondescript symptoms on starting antivirals. Once on the go, really, they are very easy to take indeed. They are, the one agent in particular is removed from the body via the kidneys. So your practitioner, the person who orders this for you, may do a kidney check to begin with. And if there are problems with the kidney, you may be advised either to take a close cousin antiviral, which is more forgiving, or you may just be given some other kinds of instructions to stop for a bit and then restart. But by and large, these are very easy drugs to take. The usual healthy, individual who's going about their daily lives, who isn't unwell, would be able to take these treatments very well indeed. There really is very few side effects to worry about. As I say, there is some monitoring that will be done in parallel with taking them, but even that is very minimal. It's important that you are not acutely or recently infected with HIV when you start. So again, somebody who knows what they're doing should check you to make sure you are in fact not HIV infected. That is very important. If there's any concern about that, again, your practitioner will give you advice as to how to be sure that you are not in a risky period of of having recent HIV infection.
Thanks very much,
and-
Professor Bekker. Let's take a short break. When we get back, we'll continue our discussion with Professor Linda-Gail Bekker and Dr. Yogan Pillay, and we'll then talk about an HIV injection that you can take to prevent HIV infection. Welcome back to the Health Hub on Newzroom Afrika and Channel 405. I am in conversation with Professor Linda-Gail Bekker from the University of Cape Town and Dr. Yogan Pillay about HIV prevention methods. Professor Bekker, there is a 2-monthly injection that you can take to prevent yourself from getting HIV. Does it work in the same way as an HIV prevention pill?
It does, Mia. You have to, in this case, get an injection into your bottom, into the muscles, the nice firm muscles of the bottom, every 2 months. But the same principle is it is an antiretroviral, again, a well-known antiviral, which is then absorbed into the body and then can block HIV in exactly the same way. The wonderful thing here is not having to take a daily pill.
Dr. Pillay, this injection exists, but it's not available in South Africa yet. Why is that?
Well, the first thing is that it's not registered by the SAPRA, the body that registers these medicines in South Africa. So what needs to happen is that the manufacturer, in this instance, a company called VIV, has to send a dossier like any other medicine to SAPRA, and SAPRA will then review it, consider its safety and efficacy, and register it if it considers it safe. And the second part of it, once it's registered, of course, it needs to be purchased by the Department of Health. And one of the key issues that the department will, of course, consider would be the advantages of this injectable relative to the current gold standard, which is, as Prof. Bekker just mentioned, the oral PrEP with those 2 ingredients in them. At the moment, as you know, and as I said earlier, the oral preparation costs 60 Rand per person per month. So for the country to afford providing the injectable free of charge in the public sector, we need to get the injectable form as close as possible to the 60 Rand per person per month. So there are 2 things that needs to happen. Firstly, it needs to be registered by SAPRA. As secondly, it needs to be affordable and made available then, if it's affordable, in the public sector. We certainly hope that this can be done because, as Prof. Bekker said, there are many advantages for many people, not everyone, but for many people, having an injectable would be more convenient. So we would like to make it available. It should be available hopefully sometime next year. We do know, though, that there are many people who are fearful of injections and would really prefer to continue with oral PrEP. But for those that have difficulty adhering, there are many advantages to the injectable, like we've seen with injectable contraceptives. Many women prefer the injectable contraceptive because it's convenient relative to taking the oral pill every day.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pillay, and thank you, Dr. Pillay and Professor Bekker, for your time and for sharing your insights this morning on Health Hub. That was Professor Linda-Gail Bekker from the Desmond HIV Tutu Centre at the University of Cape Town, and Dr. Yogan Pillay, who is a former Deputy Director General at the National Health Department, who spearheaded efforts when it comes to HIV prevention.
All right, so plenty to take away from that discussion with your great guest, Mia. What is certainly standing out for me is we have great new technologies that obviously stand to make a huge difference for people who may even be at risk of contracting the HIV virus. But that actually falls to nothing in a context where access is actually not where we need it to be.
Yes, we can actually compare it to COVID vaccines, Ayanda. Over the past few months, we have certainly learned that if you make vaccines easy to access, people are more likely to use them and to take a jab. And it's no different with HIV prevention methods. If we make HIV prevention injections and pills easy to access, in other words, cheap to afford or even for free, if we make them available at primary healthcare clinics, so within communities where people don't have to travel too far, and if we destigmatize them, in other words, not stigmatize them and say it's people who are immoral who would use such methods, then people are far more likely to take them up.
Absolutely. It does feel like we've been here before, right? And it actually links to one of the big stories that we've had in the week gone by, and that was to do with vaccine inequity, essentially. So we heard the European Union, the EU, essentially agreeing to send back some of those millions of doses of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine that underwent the full and finished process here in Bekker at the Aspen Pharmacare plant. So let's start here. How many of those doses do we know are actually making their way back?
So Johnson & Johnson is really very far behind with their delivery schedule of vaccines to South Africa. As you can see there, we ordered in February 31.2 million doses of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, and up until now we have only received about 4.2 million, which is only 14% of the doses that we've procured so far. And right now it looks like Johnson & Johnson is only going to give us another 3 million doses for the rest of September, unless those doses that come back from the EU arrive early in South Africa and they give us some additional doses from those batches.
And it comes in a context where, of course, a lot of activists have been speaking about the inequality in the distribution of vaccines across the world. It was the health minister, Dr. Joe Phaahla, on Friday, who actually mentioned that it was President Cyril Ramaphosa who, in some respects, had to kind of agitate for these doses to make their way back into this country. Given the context we're in, it's a bit sad that it had to get there.
Yeah, you would think that it's common sense to take doses that were filled and finished in a country that has only received 14% of its vaccine stock, to distribute it in that country and not to ship it off to a continent that's actually stockpiling vaccines. But we have seen vaccine inequity right from the start of this pandemic. And someone who has been writing for Bhekisisa about that is Candice Sehoma from Doctors Without Borders, and she's joining us now to explain a little bit more about it. Candice, welcome to the Health Hub, and thank you for your time and for joining us. What is your reaction to the latest developments?
Thank you so much for having me, Maya. I think it's quite an unfortunate and such a shameful situation that things had to spiral down to us calling for the vaccines to be returned into the country. And as you say, especially in light of the fact that the EU has stockpiled vaccines, and that that there's more than enough for the country, yet they still feel the need to feed off our crumbs and the little we have as the African continent. I think it's quite appalling. Beyond that, I think it's also an important indication that we cannot trust the pharmaceutical industry. Our South African government also needs to do a bit more in terms of being tougher in their demands, ensuring that the agreements benefit the continent, that the way things are set up, things need to change, and we cannot be manufacturing vaccines in the country only to export them to countries that already have enough for their citizens.
Candice, Johnson & Johnson has been producing medicine for decades. Have there been previous incidents in which they've acted in a similar way?
Yes, so this is not new. I think this anti-competitive way of doing things is not new, and we've seen that with the case of bedaquiline, which is a TB drug. It was firstly developed with taxpayer money, philanthropic money, and very important leg of the clinical trials was done in South Africa. So meaning South African citizens were part of the research and development and contributed to gathering evidence for its use in the country, which also informed decisions by the World Health Organization to recommend the drug. Despite all of those contributions, Johnson & Johnson still holds the patent on the medicine in many countries, including South Africa. The key patent of bedaquiline has been patented in South Africa until 2027, meaning that the corporation still controls, still has monopoly control over the drug, meaning that they have an upper hand on the price setting negotiation, and that can also block the potential alternative entry, or rather entry of generic companies into the market, which basically they have the control over who accesses the drug, which I think to some extent, it has affected, TB patients, where they've actually had to resort to using, toxic medication because they can't access drugs like bedaquiline. And I think we still see that in South Africa, but also in countries like India, which, there's still kind of control over the drug.
Thanks very much for your time today, Candice. That was Candice Sehoma from Doctors Without Borders, and she is the organization's Access Campaign Officer.
Sure. What I find really unfortunate, great conversation with Candice there, Mia, is that we've been here before with Johnson & Johnson. I think you asked the question about whether there have been any similar incidents, and it had to do with a TB medication. What does Johnson & Johnson have to say about, at the very least, the bad reputation they have?
So we did ask Johnson & Johnson to participate in today's program, but they unfortunately declined the invitation. But they did send us a short statement in response to the article that Candice wrote. And they said that they are still committed to helping Africa address the COVID pandemic and to facilitate equitable access to their vaccine. Johnson & Johnson also says it will continue to collaborate with the South African government for access to their vaccine.
Sure. All right. I guess only time will tell, as the cliche goes, but thanks very much indeed for coming through, giving us those great insights. And that brings us to the close of another Info Pack session of the Health Hub for this week. Remember the appointment. It's 9 o'clock every Sunday on Newsfeed AM, and that's for the Health Hub in collaboration with Bhekisisa Centers for Health Journalism. Mia Malan is the editor-in-chief there, and she'll be back again next week for the latest health insights. For Mia, once again, thanks very much.